We have our hadith of tonight. We're doing the top 50 hadith. We'll keep it short and brief, inshallah ta'ala. I just have a few points on this. Hadith, we're on hadith number 4. This hadith, to be honest, for me is the scariest hadith out of the 50. This hadith is the most dangerous hadith. In fact, this hadith is enough to keep a person up at night. Even though in the beginning it doesn't seem to be that frightening, but because of what it entails, a person has to be very, very careful. So the hadith itself is narrated by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu. قال, he says, حدثنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو الصادق المصدوق. The Prophet ﷺ spoke to us, and he is a sadiq, so he is truthful. Masduq, meaning people believed him in his truth. Right? Sadiq, masduq. So fa'il, maf'ul. So he is truthful, and he was believed in his truthfulness. Meaning both, in terms of the wahy, the revelation that he was receiving, and in terms of the companions and the Muslims believing in him. Now, here's the thing. Why is Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, question, opening up the hadith with this statement? It's because what he's about to speak about is unseen. It's matters of the unseen, meaning we can't verify it via our normal 5 senses, 6 senses, whatever you have. So because it's wahi, it's unseen, it's ghaib, we have to trust, and this is why he's saying sadiq al-masduq, he's truthful, etc. So trust him on what he's saying. Then he says, إن أحدكم يجمع خلقه في بطن أمه 40 يوما نطفة ثم يكون علقة مثل ذلك ثم يكون مضغة مثل ذلك. It says, verily the creation of each one of you is brought together in his mother's womb for 40 days, and in the form of a nutfa, which is a drop. Then it becomes a alaqa, the clot of blood or the hanging, and then for a number of time, and then a mudgha, which is that morsel of flesh, similar to that. Okay? Now, pause here. How much time has passed? 40, 40, 40, which is 120 days. Right? How many months is that? 4 months. طيب. This is one opinion. In the narrations, now in narrations like this, and in fact it's almost explicit in some of the narrations, this hadith is narrated multiple times in Bukhari, multiple times in Muslim, in various versions. Many of them, they say, mithlahu, mithlahu, mithla, which means to entail that all of these stages are happening within 40 days. Not 40 plus 40 plus 40. And in fact, Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah, classically was of this opinion. He actually said, people misunderstand that it's 120 and that it's actually 40, and then the nafkh, because this is what the hadith says, the blowing of the soul happens after the 40. And it happens in those first 10 days after the 40, somewhere in there. This is the opinion of Imam Ahmad. And then Ibn Rajab, one of the commentators on this hadith, and Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, during their time. So they lived around 600 Hijriya. Ibn Rajab was in the 7th century, 700s Hijriya. So this is like 700 years ago. They said that our doctors, meaning of our time, have confirmed an opinion closer to that of Imam Ahmad, that it happens after the 40 days, the first 40 days. It's not 120. That all of these, due to, women having miscarriages and all these other things, and they would examine and they would see what would happen. Modern embryologists also confirm the same thing. So it does go through these stages. And this is part of the miraculousness. And these are verses in the Quran that talk about this plentiful. It talks about the stages of creation, from the sperm to the meeting of the sperm and the egg. What do they call it? The zygote, yes. And then within 3 days, it becomes a alaqa. It hangs, literally on the uterus wall. It hangs within 3 days. It's alaqa. And they actually use the word literally hanging. And then after this, it becomes a morsel of flesh, mudgha, and then all of these things. All of that happens within the first 40 days. After 40 days, then he says what? This is the opinion that I follow. Now, from a fiqh point of view, there were a number of scholars who still followed 120 days. And this came up recently. Why? Because of the whole abortion issue. Is it 120 days? Is it 40 days, etc.? Which, at a minimum, it's 40 days. So after the 40 days. In fact, Imam Ahmad is on record saying that there are narrations that say it's exactly 42 or 43, within that range. But it seems to be within the first 10 after the 40. What happens? The angel comes, يُرْسَلُ الْمَلَكُ فَيَنْفُخُ فِيهِ الرُّوحِ. It blows the soul into it. So now it becomes alive. وَيُؤْمَرْ بِأَرْبَعِ كَلِمَاتٍ. And then is commanded to write 4 commands. بِكَتْبِ رِزْقِهِ, his writing down his rizq, his sustenance. وَعَمَلِهِ, his deeds. وَأَجَلِهِ, and his death. And then the last thing is شَقِيٌّ أَمْ سَعِيدٌ. And if he's happy or if he's miserable. That's literally what it means. Shaqiyun am sa'id. If he's happy or if he's miserable. These 4 things are already written when the baby is in the mother's womb after 40 days. And then he swears, فَوَاللَّهِ الَّذِي لَا إِلَهَ غَيْرُهُ. By Allah, the one who there is no God besides him. إِنَّ أَحَدَكُمْ لَيَعْمَلُ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ الْجَنَّةِ. One of you does the deeds of the people of Jannah. حَتَّى مَا يَكُونُ بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَهَا إِلَّا ذِرَاعٌ. One of you does the deeds of the people of Jannah until there's nothing but an arm span between him and Jannah. That's it. He can reach it. فَيَعْمَلُ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ النَّارِ. أيوة. فَيَسْبِقُ عَلَيْهِ الْكِتَابِ. فَيَعْمَلُ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ النَّارِ فَيَدْخُلُهَا. Then the kitab, the book, whatever's written will happen. And so he will do the deeds of the people of the hellfire, and then he will enter it, the hellfire. May Allah protect us. And then he says, وَإِنَّ أَحَدَكُمْ لَيَعْمَلُ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ النَّارِ. And one of you will do the deeds of the people of the fire, until there is nothing between him and it, إِلَّا ذِرَاعٌ, an arm span. فَيَسْبِقُ عَلَيْهِ الْكِتَابِ. Then the book, whatever is written, will transpire. فَيَعْمَلُ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ الْجَنَّةِ. He will do one of the deeds of the people of Jannah. فَيَدْخُلُهَا. And he will enter it. Right? This is an agreed upon hadith. It's narrated in almost every book of Sunan. We've taken it to be authentic. In fact, one of the sub-narrators after Al-A'mash, so after Ibn Mas'ud, there's another narrator, I forget his name, and then there's Al-A'mash, rahimahullah, he's one of the tabi'een, later tabi'een, and then one of his students. He says that I saw in a dream the Prophet ﷺ, and it was him. And then he says, in the dream, I asked him about this hadith. He says, he's like, this is strange. To me, you know what I mean? He felt like, what is this? He says, I saw the Prophet ﷺ in a dream, and I said, I've heard this hadith from Al-A'mash, because that's his teacher. He says, can you tell me, is this true? And he says, by Allah, this is of course him narrating, it's a dream. So we take it as, this is supplementary, this is not primary evidence, right? This is supplementary. But he says, the Prophet ﷺ in the dream swore, he says, by Allah, this is exactly how I said it to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. أَنَا حَدَّثْتُهُ بِهِ. Right? And may Allah forgive Abdullah ibn Mas'ud for how he conveyed from me every word that I said. And then how he conveyed it to your teacher Al-A'mash, and may Allah forgive him because of this, whoever came before him and whoever comes after him, who narrates from me this. Right? So to say, and to comfort him that this is true, this actually happened. And of course, we know from a hadithi perspective, there's no doubt because of so many different ways that this narration has happened. طيب. With that said, this hadith tells us a number of things. Our creation, what happens to us, or what happened to us, and that things are written before we're even born, especially about us. Your deeds are all written. Your sustenance, so when we say sustenance, this is literally not just how much money you're going to make. This is every breath you're going to take is sustenance, right? Every food that you're going to eat, every drink that you're going to drink, anything. Sustenance is also in your friends. Sustenance is in the company that you have. Sustenance could be rizq, could be your children. Rizq could be health. Health is definitely a big part of rizq, right? So many things, you can count them, and in fact, they are rizq. So this is why we have to realize that this is all written. And of course, your death is already written. We met a guy yesterday in the street da'wah. He started crying at the da'wah table. He was one of those he was Muslim, but when he walked by, he didn't know what was going on. When we talked to him, he's like, I haven't been to a mosque in a while. He's like, I'm moving back. I was living in Georgia. I moved back here. I'm from this area, blah, blah, blah. What happened to you? He's like, I lost everything recently. I lost my home. I lost my job. And I lost my son. I'm like, wait, what do you mean by I lost my son? He's like, my son died, overdosed on drugs at the age of 20, back in April. This guy, he's Muslim. So you talk to him, and by this time, and we're opening up and we're talking to him, it's okay, this and this and this. He starts crying, right? The grown man, he's older, going through a hard time. And one of the things that we do to comfort is to tell them, like, it was already written that this was what's going to happen. Everybody's death is already written from the moment they're born, even before they're born. This is why we can't, in a sense, we can't relax. We can't take it easy. We can't, slow down. We have to be very careful because we don't know how much time we have left in this life. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He protects us and guides us and keeps us upon the straight path. And this is really what the hadith is telling us. Right? Al-a'malu bil-khawatim. The Prophet ﷺ says, the deeds are always by how they end, not the beginnings. So a lot of times we think about the beginnings, that they're important, but in fact the most important part is the ending. How did the person end? And there's so many tragic endings. You see people that have bad endings, and this is why we always have to be careful. And this is why a person should never be fooled by the righteousness of any individual, including, and most importantly, themselves at the current moment. Right? We shouldn't be fooled by this. Just because you're praying now doesn't mean they're going to be praying later. Just because you're fasting today, and we did fast, a lot of people fasted today because of Ashura. We ask Allah that He accepts from everybody who fasted. Just because you're fasting today doesn't mean they're going to be fasting tomorrow. Just because you were righteous today, or you're reading Quran today, doesn't mean that you're going to be doing it tomorrow. Just because you're not indulging in some of these sins today, doesn't mean that you're going to be protected tomorrow. The moment you think you're safe is the moment that shaitan got you. This is really what the hadith is warning us. This is why, to me, it's so terrifying, because it tells you nobody's safe from his guidance. Nobody's safe from remaining on the path or not remaining on the path. And this is why what the Prophet Aisha says, one of the most frequent du'as that the Prophet would make, Allahumma ya muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qulubana ala dinik. Oh Allah, the turner of the hearts, keep our hearts steadfast in your religion. Some of the Sahaba, they said, Ya Rasulullah, you have come to us with the truth. You have come to us with this clear guidance. Are you afraid that we're going to be misguided? He says, woe to you. Indeed, he says, إِنَّ الْقُلُوبَ بَيْنَ أُصْبُعَيْنِ مِنْ أَصَابِعِ الرَّحْمَنِ يُقَلِّبُهَا كَيْفَ يَشَاءُ. He says, indeed, the hearts are between two of the fingers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He changes them however He wants. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can change our hearts overnight. It happens. A person can flip from one. We see how our moods change. You know what I mean? When you see somebody, you're like, oh man, you're so moody. That's actually just human nature. You're just perceiving it. But that's the reality of every single person. For some people, you can't tell. But our hearts change all the time. Our mental states, emotional states, etc., and spiritual states. Which is why we have to stay persistent. We have to stay consistent. We can't give up. And we can't be fooled by some moments of or spurts of righteousness at any time. The Prophet ﷺ used to warn his companions, do not be impressed by the good deeds that you see. There was a man, one of the tabi'een, he was praying extra prayers between Maghrib and Isha. Which, by the way, does that count for Qiyamul Layl? It does. Because it's Layl. It's night. Even though this is not a time that anybody, and we usually think of Qiyamul Layl, we're like, what? It's after, this is in the middle of the night. And that's true, that's better. But this guy, he was like, هذا وقت غفلة. He said this is a time of heedlessness where a lot of people aren't worshipping. They pray Maghrib and then they just wait until Isha. He says, he said, I went to the masjid and I was praying at the masjid. Very good. A man comes in, sits on the wall and watches him. He's just sitting there. It looks like he's watching. He doesn't know. He's praying. So while he's praying, after he finished, he goes up to the man and he says, Ya ibn akhi, oh my nephew, la taghtar bima ra'ayt. Do not be fooled by what you saw. Meaning that you think now that I'm this righteous, religious person. Don't be fooled by this. Because indeed, shaitan worshipped way more than this. And then he became what you know. Shaitan worshipped how long? How many years did shaitan worship? Hundreds? Thousands of years? Think about it. More than anyone else, us here. And he wasn't safe from his guidance. He had a moment where he was stubborn, arrogant, egotistic, etc., etc. And he says, I'm better than him. Khalas. And then it was downhill for him from there. One mistake. That's why we have to be super careful. We can't yani. Now, with all of this said, I know this sounds very scary. There's even more. I found narrations, Abdullah ibn Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah, the great Khalifa from the Umayyad Empire, where he says, we came to a man who was on his deathbed, and we wanted to do talqeen al-shahada. Talqeen is where you say La ilaha illallah to get the person to say La ilaha illallah. And he says this person was refusing. This guy was, A'udhu billah, I've never seen this before. He looks, La ilaha illallah. He's like, no, I don't want to. Yo, what the heck? And before this, he was fine. He was praying. It seemed to be that he was praying, etc. And he died upon rejecting the kalima. And in fact, he said, Mata ala al-kufr. He died upon disbelief. Because here's the thing, the moment of death is the most difficult moment of anybody's life. And it's the point where you're at your most weakest. And you never know what can happen. So Umar ibn Abdul Aziz went and asked. He said, what's wrong? What is this person? And he asked his family, and they said, he was an alcoholic. His whole life he was drinking alcohol, never stopped. I said, هذا هو. This is what caused him. Why did he say this? Some narrations of this very hadith that we're narrating now, they add the statement, فِي مَا يَبْدُو لِلنَّاسِ, in what is apparent to the people. Okay, so he's doing the deeds of the people of paradise in what's apparent to the people until he's the handspan or the arm's length away. So فِيمَا يَبْدُو لِلنَّاسِ, this means that our perception is that this is a good person. But in reality, he was never a good person. Now this added layer of understanding is what Umar ibn Abdul Aziz understood now as well. That yes, on the outside we could assume that a person is righteous, but we never know. There's something else that's going on. This happened at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And of course the opposite is true. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there's a man who's fighting, super brave, powerful. This is also an agreed upon hadith. And they asked about him, they said, do you see that guy who's fighting? And what did the Prophet ﷺ say about him? He's in the fire. Huwa fin nar. He's still alive. He hasn't died yet. And he's fighting on the Muslim side. He said, Huwa fin nar. So one of the companions says, no, he said, I have to figure out, because this guy's fighting really well, I have to figure out why this person would be in the fire. He goes over there, follows him. The guy suffers an extreme injury to where it's extremely painful. He couldn't tolerate the pain anymore. He took a sword and killed himself. And the companion that saw this comes back to the Prophet ﷺ and he says, Ashhadu annaka Rasulullah. He says, I testify that you are the messenger of God. There's no way that anybody could have known this. This is the future. But you are the messenger of God because you knew this. Allah showed it to you in Revelation, of course. And the man end up in the hellfire. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us. That's the thing. Think about this. This guy is waging jihad with the Prophet ﷺ. You can't get better than this. And he, what happened to him? Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah, I've said this before. Some of you have heard this. His son, Abdullah, who was his scribe, he wrote a lot of what we actually have from Imam Ahmad. Abdullah says, I was with my father, and he would, on his deathbed, Imam Ahmad lived to 92 years old. Okay? Hijri, not so it's like 80 something. In the solar, the Gregorian. But very old, right? So Imam Ahmad is on his deathbed. He is in and out of consciousness. And he said when he was unconscious, I heard him saying, La ba'd, la ba'd. Not yet, not yet. So his son is like, man, what? Yaba, Baba, are you okay? Father, are you okay? What's happening? You're saying not yet. What is this not yet? And he say, La ilaha illallah. Don't say not yet. What is wrong? And this is a scholar. And Imam Ahmad says, when I fell unconscious, I saw shaitan. He came to me. So imagine, he came to me on my deathbed in multiple images. One, he was trying to tell me, oh, Ya Ahmad, ana rabbuk, I am your Lord. He, disguising himself as light and all these things. You know what I mean? You're fine. We'll take care of you. Don't worry, blah, blah, blah. And Ahmad is saying, no, it's not yet. I'm not dead yet. You're not him. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. And of course it changed. And then so when it changed, Imam Ahmad, he says, shaitan now appeared in a different form. And he said, you got away from me, Ahmad. He said, Futtani ya Ahmed. Right, you got away from me. I tried to misguide you, you got away from Futtani. And then this is when he said, La ba'd, not yet. I'm not away from you yet. I'm not dead yet. Because if you the moment, so here's the thing, what does shaitan want? If he said yes, yeah, I got away from you, yes I did. Then what happens? My guard is down. As soon as my guard is down, this is when shaitan can get me to make any mistake, especially on the deathbed. And so Imam Ahmad realizes, I can't let my guard down. Not yet. I'm not dead yet. Once I'm dead, then I'm free. You know what I mean? Shaitan, you can try to, it's done. The book is sealed. Khalas, there's no more. So he realized that not yet. He's saying not yet because his guard is still up. He's still afraid of even being misguided by shaitan. And his son, this is what his son said. His son said, Yani, you are who you are and you're afraid. What are you afraid of? He says, Akhafu dhunubi. I'm afraid of my sins. That they will catch up to me now in this very instant on my deathbed, that I should slip and then end up this very hadith happening to me. That I'm there, I'm almost there to Jannah, and then I slip and I make a mistake. So he didn't want that fear. Of course, alhamdulillah, inshallah, we assume that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved him. But that's the idea, that we have to realize that our hearts are in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we're never safe. We shouldn't drop our guard. We shouldn't feel safe. Just because we're worshipping now doesn't mean that we'll continue later. But we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep us steadfast always, Ya Rabbil Alameen, and upon the straight path. One last thing, which is in the beginning, there's the writing of the four things that are written. A person might ask, the four things that are written, can those change? This is a theological question. Can those change? The answer is yes. What doesn't change is al-Lawh al-Mahfuz. But these are written on a book that the angel is given to write. And the angel actually, in some of the narrations, the angel just says, what should I write? I don't know where to get this from. And so Allah gives him access to al-Lawh al-Mahfuz, and he sees that particular information and writes it down. But he's writing it down in that scribe. It could change. We have narrations that go back to Umar and Ibn Umar and Sa'id ibn Musayyib and many others who used to say, Allahumma in kunta qad katabtani shaqiyya faktubni sa'ida. Oh Allah, if you had written that I am to be miserable, change it and write that I am to be happy. And this is narrated, the highest it gets is Umar. And if this is Umar saying this, and it's authentic to him, that tells us that he understood, he had that perception that yes, indeed, it could change. Which also means that any of the other ones could change. Your deeds that are written, anything else. With dua, yes. And with the things that Allah has mentioned. So one of them is what? What changes, for example, how old you live? Can that change? Yes. What changes it? Sadaqah? Yes. Bir. Silatul Rahim, specifically. Birrul Walidain wa Silatul Rahim. Being kind to your parents and maintaining ties of kinship. This one actually increases. وَلَا يَزِيدُ فِي الْعُمْرِ إِلَّا الْبِرِّ. This is the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. It says nothing can increase you. Now, what increase here means, this is another discussion, we've met it before. Many scholars said it's in the barakah, not the amount, but some have actually said it's both in the amount and the barakah, which is the effectiveness. Regardless, the key here is to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately always. That Allah makes us happy, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sustains us very well, that He gives us, He is generous to us in both this life and the next, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala writes upon us good deeds, and that He erases from us our bad deeds and our sins, Ya Rabbil Alameen, and that He allows us to be among those who maintain the ties of kinship and increase in their age and in their life, Ya Rabbil Alameen, and that He keeps us steadfast upon the path. هذا والله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns? Yes, go ahead. No. Yeah. There is no Islamic prescription. There are scholars who have offered their advice, and on this particular issue, many of them have differed actually with each other. Because ultimately, we're trying to judge a situation without fully knowing the repercussions, the consequences, because there's long term, there's short term. There's this misguided perception that the Constitution of the United States needs to match the Sharia. Even from an Islamic perspective, this is not correct. Who said that the Constitution has to be exactly 100% Sharia compliant? It isn't. It never will be. You are Sharia compliant in your own actions. You understand what I'm saying? And you're in your family and all these other things. So this is a longer discussion. And so here's the thing. Every scholar will tell you their opinion, right? And this is why there'll be differences of opinion, even on this. So there's not one unifying Islamic idea. Obviously, Islam is against abortion out of excuses such as finances, such as convenience. I want to continue living my life, etc. La. And more importantly, like many of the scholars, and I said this a long time ago, whenever I was asked about this, I'm like, we're not even talking about aslan, why was she pregnant to begin with? You understand what I'm saying? Promiscuity, sleeping around, the proliferation of zina, so much so that even conservative Christians are not speaking out about zina anymore. Adultery and fornication, even in conservative Christian churches, they don't even care about it anymore. Where 50 years ago, this was actually a major taboo. And they themselves have changed. That's really the cause. If we get rid of that, because here's the thing, what percentage of abortions were carried out by married couples? If you were married, how likely were you to get an abortion? It's tiny. It's a fraction of the total. And here's the thing, 60% of abortions were because of economic reasons, which tells us that we have to establish economic justice and we have to establish morality before we start issuing judgments. And we have to look at the root causes. We're looking at the symptoms. So there's a lot of things that we have to deal with. Naam? Yeah, a lot of these. There's look at what I would look at. Some of the mashayikh have said. Local scholars here in America have said on this issue. Sheikh Yasser, Yaqeen has talked about it a little bit, and many others. Yeah. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He helps us and guides us. Ya Rabbil Alameen. It's a good question. Yeah. Yeah. Ultimately, every religious group that has almost ever existed, Muslim, not Muslim, this is a long debate, has existed over the relationship between destiny and free will. Classical debate, it still exists. Literature, movies, literally you talk about it, this is there. From an Islamic paradigm, even there's been Muslim groups that have differed on the issue of qadar. Where we had the first schism in Islam was over this issue of the relationship between free will and destiny, predestination. We can talk about this all day. Our Sunni paradigm dictates that we find a middle ground. We believe in predestination, everything is written. We also believe in free agency, not free will, but free agency, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you the capacity to choose right and wrong, and you'll make those choices throughout your life. It's not absolute will, obviously nobody has that, except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that will always be predestined. Everything is predestined. Already written down 50,000 years before He created the heavens and the earth. And this is Quranic, it's in the Hadith, it's in everything. How to reconcile these? Because they seem to contradict, although in essence there's no contradiction, but because they seem to contradict, this is where ultimately the person has to do taslim. This is something that only Allah will fully understand. Because we're trying to reconcile things that we don't fully comprehend about the nature of the universe, the nature of ourselves, etc. This is why ultimately Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he says, Al-qadaru sirrun min asrarillahi ta'ala. Qadar, destiny itself, is one of the secrets of Allah. Meaning if we could fully understand it, we wouldn't be human being. We'd be more. Obviously we're not. Now, there's ways to teach it, to better understand it, but obviously, this is a quick answer. But there's the stages of qadar, there's the types of qadar. We can talk about how qadar was mentioned in the Quran. There's for us to get a better picture, but ultimately, there's going to be elements where we just have to accept and we believe. Khalas, this is it. This is why the Prophet ﷺ, he never explained it. He couldn't, obviously, from the sense that this is divine. But that the Prophet ﷺ would always tell people, you have to do your deeds, do your actions. Don't just rely on, well, Allah predestined. Let you do your deeds. فَكُلٌّ مُيَسَّرْ لِمَا خُلِقَ لَهُ. Everyone will be guided to the path that they were created for. So if Allah created you for paradise, you'll be guided to that. And if Allah created you for the hellfire, you'll be guided to that. The Prophet ﷺ came out to the people. This is a narration. It's in my notes, actually. There was not enough time. The Prophet ﷺ comes out to the people and he says, he had a book in his right and a book in his left. And he said, this one contains the names of every person to enter paradise. Their names, the names of their fathers, where they're from, etc. Not a single name will be added. Not a single name will be changed. And it's already there. And he says, and in my left I have a book that has the names of all the people of the hellfire. Their names, the names of their father, where they're from, etc. Not a name will be changed, not a name will be taken away, not a name will be added. It's already written. So people ask, okay, so then what's the point of doing deeds? If I'm there, it says, no, because your deeds are what got you here. You understand what I'm saying? Really, one of the easiest ways to identify this hadith, for example, this element of qadar, is to remove the element of time. Because remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created time and space, so He's not bound by either. He's not bound by anything. So when we understand that, if He already knows, there's no already knows. I mean, you know what I mean? That's still bound. Our language itself to describe things is bound by time. So when you remove the element of time, if future is the same as past, same as present for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it makes sense. In fact, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't know those things, He wouldn't be Allah, He wouldn't be a God. It's necessary for Him to know that. Yeah, inshallah. I hope that clarifies it, inshallah. And didn't make things worse.